This episode is brought to you by Viore. For Father's Day, give him something built for wherever the day takes him. Viore's performance joggers, breathable polos, and travel-ready layers are made to move. From workouts to downtime, on the clock or off, these are the everyday staples he'll wear on repeat. Get 20% off your first order at Viore.com/Father's Day. Exclusions apply. See site for details.
Hello, Arthur, again.
Yes, back for more.
I just can't get enough of you. We should be putting out these sessions on video in a sort of Edwardian drawing room, wearing dressing gowns with cravats and smoking cigarillos or pipes, perhaps.
Yeah.
That's very much our vibe, I feel.
Well, I mean, I'd want all listeners to know that that's exactly how I live my life.
But we have to get over that rather relaxed vibe because this is a little emergency addendum to the main podcast. No sooner had we ended our far-ranging conversation on Iran and Ukraine, Defense Secretary John Healey resigned from the government. And I think that's quite significant. Now, I've had a little bit of grief from people who are, I think, justifiably tired of media getting constantly overexcited about, well, that's it for Starmer, you know, this is a fatal blow, etc., etc. But in my defense, it's not a position I take usually. But this does seem significant. And I think it seems significant for three reasons. The first is that I don't think John Healey is given to drama, shall we say. He's a fairly measured person that is not really precipitous with his political moves. The second is that he is, I would put him down as a top 5 Starmer loyalist in the cabinet. And he's a close personal friend of Starmer as well. So I'm sure this is something he didn't do lightly. Mm-hmm. And the third reason is that I think the defense brief, is just so loaded right now, considering what we will be discussing in the main body of the B-Side podcast. It's such a fractious situation globally. Promises to upspend are so linked to what the US is demanding of NATO allies, and they're linked to the defense of Ukraine, and they're linked to this idea that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet. And the defense investment plan had been delayed and delayed and delayed, and is already quite a hot potato issue for the government. So I think for a loyalist to resign at this point in time with such a loaded resignation letter that he will know will be quoted, it seems to me quite significant. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think if we look at this issue of the defense investment plan, it's something that was being rumbled about in defense circles at the start of the year. And I was hearing that from people I deal with in my professional life. And then the opposition parties, particularly the Tories, started talking about it in select committees, and eventually Kemi Badenoch herself. And it's one of the rare cases where you don't have to be a true blue Tory to see that they had a point. The Strategic Defence Review was concluded last year, and we have made a commitment with all the other NATO members to massively increase our defence spending, and yet we seemed unable to come up with a plan for how we would do that. And so there was clearly something going wrong, badly wrong. And then, as we now learn from John Healey's resignation letter, that he only received the final calculations for the defence investment plan on Monday. So this is something that was supposedly going to be ready in January, and we're 6 months later. And this is not an obscure corner of government. This is probably top 3 of the priorities that the government has at the moment. And I think it plays into this issue that Keir Starmer seems quite good at identifying and articulating the things that need to be done, but completely hopeless at taking the decisions that have to go with that. And he just doesn't seem to be able to do the two things.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's the full thing. I think there is definitely something in it. Don't get me wrong. I started out thinking that this ability that he has to resist pressure and say, no, I will look at all the facts and I will make a reasoned decision in my own time was an immense strength for a prime minister, especially after having lived through Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And it has stood him in good stead, for instance, in not overreacting to every brain fart that comes out of Trump because he says it one day and unsays it the next. And so actually keeping your powder dry is a very smart strategy. But I think in other areas, it feels to me like it's become displacement activity. Instead of it being a way of making the right decision, it's become a way of not making a decision.
Yeah.
And you kind of see it in various areas. Having said that, I don't want to write a blank check to the Defense Department because it doesn't have a good history of spending it well, actually. This needs to happen with tighter procurement. It needs to happen with reform within the department itself. I think, people like George Robertson, they come out, they make statements, it makes a big splash, quite rightly so. I don't wish to impugn George Robertson's character, but he is knee-deep into the defense industry, advising several firms. So you would expect him to be pushing for as much money to be spent on defense as possible, right? There is an agenda there. So I'm not one of those people that just says, oh, well, it's such a moment of peril. Just shove gazillions their way and let them spend it however. I don't think it should be that. I think there can be very successful private-public partnerships. I don't understand why the government itself hasn't gone into the basic manufacturing of consumables, actually, like Ukraine does. It seems to be quite a straightforward thing to do. It would generate jobs and it would generate GDP, but I'm not the expert on that. So I'm not a knee-jerk hawk, is what I'm trying to say when it comes to defense. But it does seem that when this thing is in the news, and it's already been identified as something that's been delayed and delayed and delayed, to not have the Secretary of State responsible for that brief on board way before you let them see the bottom line, to not have them involved in all the conversations going on before they get that final, here's how much you're getting on Monday, it just seems like really bad management.
Yeah. I can completely agree, Alex, that there's a history, there's a decades-long history of poor management of defense finances. And of course, there's a big hungry industry that likes to monetize everything it can. I suppose what troubles me is the sense that 6 months in, what the defense investment plan was finally going to be doesn't feel like it was going to be any different from the baseline that was probably there in January. And so the difficulty is that, yes, I think there is a strength of you don't rush to decisions. You don't do a sort of Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, oh, I've just had an idea, let's do that. But equally, if 6 months later, you don't really seem to have a plan, because at the moment, the plan as described by John Healey, i.e. the Prime Minister's preferred plan, is basically not to increase defence spending, but say that we will increase it about 10 years from now. And actually, that's just embarrassing. That's not a real approach. The Prime Minister last week gave a speech saying that we're under serious threat from Russia. Are we dealing with someone who is very thoughtful, very cautious, making decisions, having got all the evidence, or someone who just simply refuses to commit to a decision?
The median explanation is that Starmer, instead of being the person that unlocks the decision by listening to different sides and deciding what should happen, is a sort of middle manager caught between Treasury and Department of Defense. And that's what I sense between the lines. I actually sense that this was a fight between John Healey and Rachel Reeves, that Rachel Reeves won. And that's why John Healey is resigning. And Starmer's fault is not resolving it in a way that preserved really the structural integrity of his core team, which he could and should have done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's clearly the case, that ultimately this is a Treasury call. And if it is the case that the Prime Minister supports the Treasury on this, then he's going to have to articulate that very clearly. I think one of the questions that flows from this is if John Healey feels that the country's defences are inadequate, and he must feel that because he hasn't just grumbled quietly, he has publicly resigned. I think it's rather interesting to wonder what will happen to some of the other senior figures, because we must therefore assume that the defence chiefs, the senior officers, at least some of them, take a similar view. And we've already heard Al Khan's, who is, of course, a defence minister, but rather importantly, was not long ago a very senior military officer, say publicly today that the defence investment plan is not fit for purpose. I would be very surprised if Healey is the only one to shift over this.
Tonight at 10, first the Defence Secretary, now the Armed Forces Minister. Both have dramatically quit the government today over the Prime Minister's defence spending plans. John Healey accused Sir Keir Starmer of not spending enough to defend Britain at a time of rising threats. And in a letter, Al Khan's told the Prime Minister that the armed forces are being asked to operate in a more dangerous world on a budget written for a calmer one.
So the Defence Secretary resigns, and in the last hour, a replacement is found. Dan Jarvis, a former soldier, gets the job.
Of course, Healey, he's an experienced politician of 30 years. Of course, he understands and is part of the internal political flows within the Labour Party. But I don't get the sense that he's particularly someone that's acting on behalf of, let's say, Andy Burnham or West Streeting. I mean, it might be that he's acting on behalf of himself or Al Kearns, and we're about to see an interesting entry into the potential race for Labour leader. That I cannot exclude, because I think someone from the defence side actually would have a very strong claim to being a person that might be able to unite the party and lead the government at this difficult time. So my spidey sense is tingling a little bit in that direction. You just had a conversation with a very, very knowledgeable source that you will actually release as a Behind the Lines episode before this goes out.
Yeah, we focused more on the real desperate situation in our armed forces and the degree to which actually, if you just carry on with the resources we have at the moment, you are really not able to steady a ship that is, to stretch the metaphor a little, listing in the storm.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting few days, I think, because to me this feels significant. Like I said, I'm not a knee-jerk, oh, that's it, Starmer's done person. He has weathered many, many storms, and he may well weather this one, but I can't actually see a way through it. It seems too wounding a departure at a point when he's already quite weakened. One last question. Do you think that there is a way to kind of salvage the situation, to reverse the decision quite quickly in a way that doesn't look cack-handed, and do something that kind of recognizes the urgency and the peril that Europe is currently in?
Well, it's interesting because there was a line in Healey's letter that said something like, you're aware that other mechanisms exist and our European partners are using some of these to fund their own defense. Now, I don't know whether he's hinting at this idea of kind of war bonds or defense bonds, which some of the other parties have talked about as a certain concept.
Or the safe fund, an equivalent over here. Because actually the fiscal rules do allow borrowing to invest.
Absolutely. And we can be cynical about the defense industry, but what it does do is employ a lot of people in really good manufacturing jobs with a good value chain and lots of training and all kinds of apprenticeship opportunities and all the sorts of things that a mature industrial economy needs.
Like I said, it will be interesting, and we will now get back into the regular episode and our conversation on Iran and Ukraine. And actually, a conversation that left me quite uplifted, because there does seem to be a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Let's hope it's not a flamethrower. Quiet Riot. Welcome to Quiet Riot B-Side, the deep dive companion to the News and Politics Thursday chat. I'm Alex Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, here to change the record.
And I'm Kenny, maintaining A-side and B-side discipline to make sure we don't end up at the C-side.
Now, yesterday we looked into the framework of tolerance and diversity that has held this country together, beginning to be picked at from various sources and in various ways. Economic scarcity is always the perfect stage for this sort of nativist division, and it is perhaps no coincidence that prosperity around the world is being affected by dividers-in-chief like Putin and Trump, who use economic chaos as a deliberate weapon of division.
So today we plan to get back into the weeds in Iran and Ukraine, because there's been some pretty significant developments on both fronts, not least of which has featured old Yaxley Lennon giving his tuppence worth from Moscow.
And who else would we lock in for all things foreign affairs than our colleague, friend, and sage, Arthur Snell?
Quiet Riot. Welcome, Arthur.
Hello, Alex.
Arthur, it really is something when the US president announces that America is hours away from a peace deal with Iran, which would resolve the gridlock that has basically resulted in a global economic crisis. And markets do the equivalent of an eye roll, the dial barely moving. So we're at the place now where the world, politically and economically, simply disbelieves the White House. How did we get here?
Yeah, it is extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, we're all very familiar with the story of the boy who cried wolf. And Trump is the boy who cried wolf about 38 times. And at that point, the wolves are definitely coming for you.
The BBC Live blog, as we record, opens with the following sentence. The US and Iran have exchanged strikes across the Middle East for a second consecutive day, further straining a shaky ceasefire agreed between the two countries. How would you define a ceasefire?
Yeah, well, that's one of these words that future dictionaries will have a pre-2026 and a post-2026 meaning. Yeah, it's interesting because ceasefire, both in the context of US and Iran, but also Israel and its assault on Lebanon, which of course is intimately linked with this whole story, in both cases has been observed in the breach, as the saying goes. At the early point of this conflict, we were all acutely aware of the fact that Donald Trump had probably learned to manipulate the oil markets, and one suspects friends of his were doing well from that. And I've come to think that I imagine that the IRGC now running Iran are also able to play that game too. And of course, they are also a very corrupt and venal group of people who would no doubt quite like to benefit on their side of things.
Yeah,
so
I
think
hadn't thought of that, but of course you're right, I think.
you've got two very cynical players. There are lots of calculations going on, but one of them might be the fact that the desire to trade the news is not unique to the American side.
A couple of days ago, you had a really good conversation with Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie Campbell.
And we will put a link to that full episode in the notes so that people can go and listen to that in the Behind the Lines podcast. What is your impression? What are we looking at here? Increasingly, I see all security analyst theories, however far-fetched they were to begin with, sort of fall away. And there is now only head-scratching in response to the question, what is the off-ramp for the White House? What is the end game for Washington here?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question because I think all the considerations of off-ramps and acceptable outcomes to both sides assume a very different cast of characters. And in particular, the challenge you have with Donald Trump is that he can't stick to anything for more than a few days. His people know that. The Iranians very clearly know that. And the Israelis know that. And I think it's important to consider Israel in all of this, because after all, this current flare-up, to some extent, has its roots in the ongoing Israeli actions in South Lebanon targeting Hezbollah, where Israel sees that as a separate but related action, and Iran sees that as an inherent part of this conflict. And the fact that, you have Trump trying to tell the world, oh, I call the shots when it comes to Netanyahu, where we kind of know that he doesn't really, that adds to the complexity of this. But if we go back to this off-ramps question, I mean, one of the things that came out of my discussion with Charlie Campbell was that at one point, a lot of energy was being expended amazingly. I mean, this tells us something about the madness of the current age. It was expended in the Americans trying to work out how they would get a share of the revenue being collected by the Iranians from the Straits of Hormuz, which is a pretty mind-boggling thought. This is, an international shipping lane, which two countries, in contravention of all standards and norms in international maritime law, thought that they would try to monetize.
I know it's a striking thing to say, Arthur, but this has all the hallmarks of two criminal organizations fighting over turf.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. And I think some people might roll their eyes and sort of saying, oh, Arthur and Alex have lost it a bit. But the US is behaving like a rogue state. This is a country that created and structured a series of international global norms post-World War II. And of course, there's a long debate to be had about the way that they benefited, and they didn't always obey their own rules. But they were basically the sort of guarantor. And now they're just behaving like a rogue state that just takes advantage where it sees it can.
It's a protection racket.
Yeah,
like really,
absolutely.
Quite explicitly, they are putting in place a protection racket. And I, for one, as you know, look forward to the euro becoming the world's reserve currency. Because if they keep going in this direction, that's the main benefit they got. And it's not a benefit that can't be ungifted. I heard one person, and I found this quite interesting. I will also put it to Naomi because I know she's been keeping a beady eye on this region, that basically shifted the perspective and said, if you look at it from the point of view of someone like Hegseth, who is a cartoon character, really, it becomes ideological. So we have this massive army, why not use it? This becomes performative. So they're doing it because it looks awesome to them. I mean, are we in a world where it could actually be as simple as that they're using these weapons because they're actually boys playing with deadly toys?
I think that's part of it. And I think what's interesting is, in a way, if the system was completely run by people like Hegseth and Trump, they probably would have fired nuclear weapons at Iran already. And obviously, we should all be very happy that that didn't happen. But I think we're in this position where the US is clearly at the leadership level, is clearly being run by a kind of organized crime mentality. But it has a professional military. It still has even the negotiators, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who are by no means qualified and by no means clean hands, but they're still people who probably are slightly more in the world of reality and less in the sort of cartoonish world that Trump and Hegseth operate in.
Although there have been a couple of high-profile resignations recently in the Pentagon that caused my eyebrow to go up a little bit, because I thought, these are experienced people who are basically looking at what's being asked of them, and they go, that's not something I can deliver. Because I suspect behind the scenes there's a lot of foot stomping and going, why can't we make them do the thing we want them to do?
Yeah. And if they don't do it, why don't we just bomb even more of Tehran or whatever? There's clearly a lot of discomfort in the senior military, and other bits of the system have been bypassed altogether. And I think also Venezuela's an interesting point here. You see, Trump began the war with what for him was a perfect military operation. It was very cool. It involved heroic guys going in. It was all kind of Hollywood movies territory. And at the end of it, he won. He now has
what he wanted.
He got a cut of the Venezuelan oil industry. He doesn't give a damn about democracy and human rights, but he got what he wanted. And he knew that Iran was a bit different and a bit more complicated. But his basic idea was, I kill the supreme leader and a few of the other people at the top. They come begging. I then do a deal for the oil and we're good to go. And I'm the president who brought down this fabled terrorist regime. And I've read reporting about this. He keeps going back and saying, why can't it be like Venezuela? And of course, the answer involves experts talking at him at a length of time. And of course, his brain can't deal with that. So he gets cross. Why is this thing not like the thing I want it to be? It's very disappointing to him. And he's cross about it. The challenge comes back to this point that Iran have much more staying power. And this is the extraordinary irony that, again, how many times have we been told that Iran's military has been destroyed? That it's got no capacity to do anything anymore. And we've been told this so many times. And of course, Iran is still able, as it did overnight, to strike at really quite significant targets.
Yes, and that slightly brings me to the more professional side of things, because it's easy to blame the White House for all of this. But was there a gross miscalculation at the intelligence level about Iran's military capability and reserves?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And of course, while all this is going on, there's an attempt to put an amazingly unqualified person in as the Director of National Intelligence. This is the role previously held by Tulsi Gabbard, which is a sort of coordination role in the multifarious different intelligence agencies that the US has. Now, I'm sure it's perfectly possible that there was a massive miscalculation, but I think what's more likely is it's quite simply, again, Trump didn't want to hear it, and Hegseth didn't want to hear it.
And can you tell listeners who they're trying to replace Tulsi Gabbard with?
So Tulsi Gabbard's credentials to be the Director of National Intelligence were very thin. But to give her credit, she had served in the military, in uniform, in a theatre of war in Iraq. Albeit she had very problematic
before she went basically mad.
Yeah, and sort of then sided with Bashar al-Assad and appeared to be very close to Putin and all the rest of it. But that's who she was. That's who she is. The proposed replacement, Bill Pulte, is someone who has never worked one single day in any kind of intelligence, national security, or defense job. But what makes him qualified in Trump's eyes is that he is an extreme MAGA loyalist. He is the one who was trying to bring down various people, such as Senator Adam Schiff, such as one of the governors on the Federal Reserve Board, on the basis of their mortgage application details. And so he's currently running a kind of government-backed mortgage bank. And the idea that he's been pursuing is that if you can catch someone, it's like getting Al Capone on his taxes. If you catch someone on their mortgage application, then you can bring criminal charges against them. And of course, the only people you investigate are people who are perceived opponents of Trump. So that's who he is. He's an uber loyalist. He's never worked a single day in intelligence. And the idea would be that he is then the superintendent of all of the intelligence agencies of the world's most powerful military and security power.
If you had told me a year and a half ago that we would be looking at Tulsi Gabbard fondly as the more qualified intelligence chief, I would have laughed at you. I really would.
No, it really is. I mean, it's someone proposes their dog, and you say, well, what, your dog isn't qualified. Yeah, but, have you seen my tortoise?
Quiet Riot. Starting or growing your own business can be intimidating and lonely at times. Your to-do list may feel endless with new tasks, and lists can easily begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything as a built-in business partner can be a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Gymshark, Rare Beauty, and Heinz, to brands just getting started. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that can help you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. And you can tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. And if people haven't heard about your brand, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. That's shopify.com/realm.
Quiet Riot. Charlie said something to you in that recent episode that really struck a chord with me. Once you start striking non-military targets, I mean, aside from this being highly problematic for all sorts of reasons, it also signals, importantly, that you've run out of military targets. Let's have a little listen, actually.
It's such a truism at times like this for people to say, well, the Americans don't have a plan, but they really don't have a plan, and Israel doesn't have a plan because it feels like it doesn't need to have a plan beyond basically destroying everything. And I think what we're seeing now, if you look at the targeting of the US in Iran, the hitting of kind of civilian targets, i.e. energy infrastructure, that to me shows that they've run out of military targets. And if you run out of military targets and you start hitting oil depots and your enemy still hasn't buckled, it feels like there is a swing there, and that swing is not necessarily in your favor. And the question that comes up in my mind at the moment is, where do they go?
Is Iran in a strangely strong position here that will require compromise on the American side on any deal? And is that what is actually delaying the deal? That the White House cannot get that clear victory like they did in Venezuela, that they can present to their faithful as, here we are, we prevailed.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you've just put it perfectly there, Alex. And just to talk about this targeting of non-military sites, I just saw overnight, there's reporting from the New York Times, so clearly a very credible source, that there was a US strike specifically against a water supply that supplies tens of thousands of people in a region of southern Iran. This is, of course, a country that has extreme weather, particularly at this time of year. You'll get temperatures way up in the high 30s, maybe even in the 40s. That's basically a war crime. If Israel does that to Gaza, lots of people rightly would call it out as a war crime. And I don't think it's any different if the US is doing it. But what's interesting here is if we remember that Iran is run by a very brutal regime that's indifferent to the well-being of its own citizens.
Well, it kills tens of thousands of them of its own accord.
Exactly. So they are willing to take a level of discomfort and desperation that almost nowhere on earth will put up with. And I'm not even talking about Russia here. You know, this is a level above that even. And I think this is the problem, that the US wants Iran to come along on bended knee and beg forgiveness, and we'll do everything you say, and particularly for Trump and Hegseth and this kind of weird macho MAGA psychology. That's a necessity. And the other big thing is, the other really major complicating factor is that Trump's response to the Obama nuclear deal, Obama era, we might say, nuclear deal, was one of his first big calling cards in politics. So he is incredibly vulnerable to the fact that one of the few deals you could make with Iran is something that looks a little bit like the Obama deal. And Trump will know this. And of course, most Americans know this, even MAGA supporters, because they were all riled up about how terrible, the worst deal in history and all the rest of it. So anything that even has an approximation of that deal is very, very difficult. I would think politically almost impossible for the Americans to arrive at. So I think you've got all these factors that in some respects, it shouldn't be hard to make a deal with Iran. But given the current people involved, it's almost impossible.
Arthur, do you think the potential for escalation in different directions has been underpriced? I was struck by a story overnight about an Indian ship being hit by American forces with actual fatalities. India's shipping minister summoning the deputy head of the US embassy in Delhi. Do you think that there's been a little bit of ignoring other powers in the area, the stakes they have in this, especially as the US is attacking them on other fronts as well, applying tariffs and things like that?
Yeah, the ramifications of this over the longer term for America's previous allies are profound. So let's talk about the UK for a moment. I mean, you've mentioned India, that's a good case study, but the UK, obviously, there's been a lot of bad blood, particularly around the question of the use of Diego Garcia by US Air Force, which of course is currently British territory, but a deal could be in place to transfer sovereignty to Mauritius. Now, the latest reporting out of the US is that Trump wants to buy Diego Garcia. That's a sign of a crisis between the US and the UK. And I don't think we can disconnect that from the rabid radicalization which is being done by American supporters of the MAGA movement on the British hard right. You know, these are all joined together. So we're in this era.
I mean, J.D. Vance coming out and shooting his mouth off.
Yeah, and the X platform being weaponized, and the idea of a civil war in the UK has become an obsession on the American right.
I think that's right, Arthur. And I want to say something here because we were talking about the situation in Belfast in yesterday's main episode. There is a sense, I think, that America dipped its toe in Germany. It went badly. It dipped its toe in Spain, actually, supporting Vox. It went badly. It dipped its toe in Hungary, and it went catastrophically badly. They actually
didn't dip a toe. It jumped right into the deep end. And
they ended
failed.
Up losing.
Embarrassed themselves.
And because Nigel Farage and Reform are in a position of strength in the polls at the moment, I think they see the UK as their last hope to look relevant in a way, to look like they can influence European politics.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think clearly the Iran war is not the only aspect of this. Trump's dislike of NATO, his support of Russia, the tariffs, there's a whole package of measures, and Iran war is one element of this. We talked about the end of the transatlantic alliance and J.D. Vance's speech at Munich and all those sorts of things. But we're now seeing what that looks like in real life. It looks like Trump deciding he's going to buy Diego Garcia. It looks like Indian vessels being hit, probably, accidentally. But the point is the US has kind of stopped caring. It thinks it no longer needs allies. And I guess what's different about this, the US has had periods of isolation in the past, but this isn't isolation. This is antagonism. The US is interfering in our politics. It's not saying we're not interested. It's saying we've decided, and after all, their own national security strategy identified cultivating resistance, that's the term they use, as one of their priorities for Europe. They see the objective as supporting, whether it's Tommy Robinson or Farage or Rupert Lowe or a whole panoply of these hard right, radical right figures.
Jeremy Bowen, for whom I have a lot of respect, wrote a couple of days ago that Trump and Netanyahu believed that victory over Iran would reshape the Middle East. And they are sort of right. The region is being reshaped, just not at all in the way they expected. It's moving into attritional perma-crisis.
Yes.
And it's affecting links that also depended on this good relationship with the US between European allies and Israel. Quite underreported because of everything going on in Belfast, I think. Yesterday, the UK, along with Australia, Canada, France, and Norway, have imposed sanctions on networks involved in financing Israeli-occupied West Bank.
Yes.
You have all the strikes in Lebanon, which led to the spectacle, really, of Trump having to come out and say, no, they didn't defy me. The White House put out a briefing that he had called Netanyahu and shouted at him, telling him to stop all strikes because they were very close to a peace deal and he was really mucking it up.
Yeah.
And 3-4 hours later, there was a major strike in South Lebanon. And he had to come out and say, no, those were already launched. I mean, what?
I just had a brief telephone call with President Trump in which I asked him about his recent conversations with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Donald Trump is worried that Israeli strikes in Iran could jeopardize ongoing peace talks. So I asked the president, what was it he said to Mr. Netanyahu to get him to stop the attacks? But he told me, all I said was, we have to use common sense. We're very close to signing a very powerful deal, a very good deal. But, I said, Mr. Netanyahu defied you on Sunday night. You asked him not to attack Iran, and he fired off missiles nonetheless. No, said Mr. Trump, that's not what happened. He told me the missiles were already on the way by the time the two leaders spoke, so there was nothing that could be done about it. Now, that is very convenient timing, and it does explain why we haven't seen the sort of furious response from Donald Trump you might expect if he thought that he had been defied by Benjamin Netanyahu. What he said was, talking about the missiles, they had already gone. They were already on their way, he told me. And then he said, talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, if I tell him to do something, he does it. That's obviously Donald Trump trying to assert that he's still the one in charge of what's happening in the Middle East, regardless of what we see from the Israeli PM.
Well, if one thinks of what we were talking about earlier, this kind of macho teenage boy persona and the way that that appeals to his MAGA base, many of whom we might add are probably anti-Semites, it's very difficult for him to have to admit that he's got no ability to control Netanyahu and that Netanyahu is going to carry on doing whatever he wants for as long as he wants. And Trump is in a bind there because actually he does need support from people who are powerful allies of Israel, and his base is increasingly turning anti-Israeli. We know that the MAGA movement has got this kind of fundamental split now between those who are, many of them driven by a kind of fascistic anti-Semitism, and others perhaps driven by a more critical approach. But either way, there's an anti-Israel side to the American right, which is new and growing.
Well, one might say it's very old, Arthur.
Well, yes,
I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's as old as the hills, but it's regained.
Yeah, its reemergence is very notable.
Yeah, and these people like Nick Fuentes and so on, out and out kind of Nazi level anti-Semites. What you have now is a situation where perhaps what we might argue is that years of America both financing Israel and failing to prevent Israel from doing the things it is doing, that those particular chickens have come home to roost.
Quiet, Riot. This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Quiet, Riot. Let me take you now thousands of miles northwest. Because whereas the world contained, I think, only existential crises this time last year, I would say that this summer, generally speaking, one can say, I have bad news and I have good news, because unlike the sort of Lovecraftian, unnameable chaos in the Middle East, there really is a sense that the situation in Ukraine is changing. Ukrainian forces overnight carried out another missile attack deep inside Russia, hitting a major military plant. You had another conversation the week before, and I think that was before the big embarrassing strike on St. Petersburg during that so-called alternative Davos. Are we fooling ourselves into believing that there's a real change of the wind? Or is there genuinely now a Ukraine that's coming out on top?
I think it's the second. I think there is genuinely this big change. And no, we are not fooling ourselves. Now, what I would say before I go any further is that there is a lot that needs to happen for Ukraine to win. And how do we define winning? So Ukraine is making progress, but it's making it incredibly slowly. But the point is, it's making progress. And there are just a few statistics that bear this out. And I've written a Substack about this, so I encourage people to take a look. But one statistic is that Russia's ability to recruit soldiers, and of course its tactics are to just throw thousands of men into a kind of bloodbath, indifferent to casualty figures. Russia's ability to recruit soldiers is not keeping pace with the rate at which it's losing them killed and injured. So that is a big problem if your main method of warfare is just throwing men at the front. The second thing to note, the balance of 2025 was Russia gradually, very, very slowly, not at a rate that could defeat Ukraine, but at a rate that was very difficult for Ukraine, gradually gaining ground in Ukraine. Now, that has reversed now. Now, Ukraine is, on balance, gradually regaining ground, we should say, from Russia. So these are two very significant developments. But then we layer on top of that Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russia, whether it's St. Petersburg, when the summit's going on, you can imagine the humiliation for Putin, particularly Putin's whole identity is St. Petersburg. It's where he's from. It's where he had his early career. That's his sort of home territory. So very, very humiliating.
I bet he still calls it Leningrad.
I'm sure he does. The Ukrainians striking at Russian oil and gas terminals. And of course, the thing about Russia is that it is such a big country, and it means that there are an enormous number of targets, and it is hard for Russia to defend. Russian history is a history of massive invasions and Russia retreating, and its defense is effectively the ability to give up territory, which it will regain at some later stage. Now, I'm not proposing that Ukraine will invade Russia, but there is a point here that once you have a highly capable adversary, which is what Ukraine has become with its long-range drones, it is very difficult for Russia to defend. But the other thing that Ukraine is doing with great efficacy is this kind of medium-range targeting of Russian logistics. So it's getting harder and harder for Russia to supply its forces. And that explains some of this shift of the balance that why Ukraine is advancing. So that is a long answer to say, yes, you're right. We do have grounds for optimism. And I think what makes this particularly powerful, this is in spite of the fact that America is, of course, being much less generous with its military support. And it shows that Ukraine is increasingly able to do this with its own weaponry and with technologies that it has developed itself.
Mm-hmm. And for the first time also, Arthur, I'm picking up reports of anonymous but high-level criticism from inside the Putin machine against Putin, which does say to me that there are people who made a conscious decision to brief an international journalist about their unhappiness with the situation. Isn't that a step we haven't seen before?
Yeah, I agree. So the other element of this is that as the war gets harder for Russia, the impact on middle and upper class Russians living in Moscow and St. Petersburg becomes heavier. And Putin's complete strategy from day one has been to make this thing not a war. Of course, he calls it a special military operation. It's a thing that doesn't affect the lives of the well-connected Russians who are the support base for Putin. But that is no longer the case. So the economic impacts, the inflationary impacts, the fact that Russia has basically unplugged the mobile internet. It's a society just like in the UK, where you might use an app to call a taxi or order a takeaway. All those things that wealthy and middle-class Russians enjoy has got very complicated and difficult. And this is where people start to think, oh, hang on, this isn't just about anonymous kids from the far provinces dying against Ukraine, and we don't really think Ukraine's a proper country. This is now causing us discomfort. So I think it's not surprising that we might start to get, still obviously anonymous briefings, but still briefings to senior Western journalists or whatever, saying, well, we're pretty unhappy with this, and something needs to change.
I mean, in an environment that is so fractious, that punishes disloyalty so severely, and where everything is bugged, it really is a big decision to brief Western media that you're unhappy with their leader. I think Ewan MacDonald actually put it very well in the episode that updated the situation in Ukraine that you did a couple of weeks ago.
Russia has been able to drag this war out, and the longer the war is dragged out, then the more likely I thought that Putin would be able to outlast the West. It's been ups and downs. During the campaigns in the winter, where we lost power for hours and hours and every day, was depressing. But the power has returned. Things have been getting better. Now there are these big strikes, but we're weathering them. Now, I think what we're seeing is, I would cautiously say that we are seeing a turning point in the war. And although I wouldn't like to predict an end of the war coming, I think, to paraphrase Churchill, we're near the beginning of the end. I hope that this war will not go on for much longer.
Arthur, thank you very much. As always, it's been an absolute joy chatting to you. The call to action, first of all, is for everyone to go and subscribe or follow, depending on the application you use, the podcast Behind the Lines. It really is your one-stop shop for keeping informed about this stuff, and also subscribe to your Substack, of course. Is there any other call to action that you would like to raise?
We shouldn't forget what's been happening both in Lebanon and still in Gaza, where desperate populations are living in really, really tough situations. So I think if anyone feels motivated to do something, have a look at the various NGOs that are active there. Obviously, Médecins Sans Frontières, UNICEF, there are various others. I think that's a part of the world that has been sadly forgotten as our attention has looked elsewhere.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you.
Riot. Spotify, it's Jay Shetty. Are you one of those media strategy people? Scrolling through spreadsheets, searching for an audience that pays twice as much attention to your ads than they do on social? Let me introduce you to Fans. And they're here with me on Spotify. Trust me, I know Fans. They don't skip, they stay for hours. They don't move on, they manifest. They're not a demographic group, they're fans.
Spotify advertising. You're among fans.
Riot. Naomi, you've been particularly watchful of developments in Ukraine, haven't you? Because there does seem to be really a change.
Yeah, thank God. Yeah, look, the last 2 months, Russia has been making either extremely minuscule territorial net gain or actual losses. And I think it's striking. Meanwhile, Ukraine is continuing a very high rate of investment in drone technology. Its middle range strike capability has improved hugely since the beginning of this year. And they've disrupted a lot of Russian supply lines. And the Ukrainians are just being much more innovative. And I think that is really helping tip the balance. And of course, Russia will adjust. But while they're adjusting, Ukraine is innovating again. And against the backdrop of Iran in particular, Russia really ought to be cashing in on the boost in oil prices. But Ukraine has been hitting its oil terminals. They've had targeted attacks in and around St. Petersburg. There was this very high prestige event that happened a week or so ago. Ukraine hit a naval base on an island just off St. Petersburg, as well as in the immediate vicinity. You could see fumes from that exhibition space, all quite humiliating for Putin. I think the Finnish president has estimated that you've got about an 8-to-1 ratio of Russian to Ukrainian casualties. And really importantly, because of the drone technology, you're seeing the ratio killed in action has gone up because of drones, right? So casualties are now often fatalities on the Russian side, very, very sadly for the Russian people. So I think the pendulum really has swung to Ukraine. And it's really I think, undermining Putin's ability to say that Russia is winning, even slowly. And it's going to be hard for them to keep up that narrative. And you've got Armenia. They've just returned a pro-EU government. That will have depressed Moscow, following pretty soon after the election in Hungary, where Magyar's party did extremely well and have now been able to get the Ukraine funding from the EU unlocked that previously Orban had been blocking. You've also actually, for once in his goddamn life, had Elon Musk being quite helpful. Of course, he owns Starlink, the main comms channel. They've been much stricter about only letting Ukrainians use the network. So you've now got Ukraine not only with this drone advantage, technology advantage, but also a comms advantage. And I don't know how Russia is likely to respond. They might go back for more forced mobilization and calling up more reservist troops. That will make them even more unpopular at home.
Do you know the thing that stood out for me? There was a report that because Ukraine has really upped its targeting of fuel and oil supplies, that in Crimea, Russian tourists are complaining because they're being restricted. They can only take 4 gallons of fuel at a time because they can't get fuel in.
Yeah.
And it's a little reminder of how normalized the situation in Crimea, which, let's remember, is only a stone's throw away from the lands that are being fought over as we speak.
Yeah.
And yet it's become it's still a holiday destination for relatively wealthy Russians. And they can't fill the cars up. And that's what it's taking to wind them up.
It has always been, in Chekhov Place, the dashes where they holiday are always in the Crimea. It's quite interesting. And we began this sort of cycle of violence by how important Crimea was to Russia, and establishing this corridor to Crimea, this land corridor, made it quite secure, etc., etc. And it's interesting that the opposite also is true. So I've seen quite a few bits of analysis recently that suggest Crimea has become quite an albatross around Russia's neck, because they are finding that corridor difficult to completely defend, which means that they can only protect it in naval and air terms, which is very expensive. And so there's an interesting churn going on there, as my conversation with Arthur, I think, reflected. Now, on Iran, that just depends on whatever Trump decides he's going to say that morning. One morning, they're minutes away from a deal. The next morning, he's threatening to bomb them again.
The next morning, he's fast asleep.
Yeah. What is the off-ramp here? This is the bit that I can't wrap my head around.
From Trump's perspective, there's no off-ramp. But then from Trump's perspective, his brain doesn't function properly, doesn't function like a normal human being anyway. So the need for an off-ramp isn't as important as it might be to you or I. As long as in his own head he thinks he's won, that will be significant for him. But from a strategic perspective, from a tactical perspective, there's no way out of this at the moment that doesn't leave America, and indeed the rest of the world, in a far worse position than before all of this nonsense kicked off in the first place.
Yeah, and there's been some quite high-profile resignations as well.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the off-ramps he often leans towards is focusing his attention elsewhere. And it just wouldn't surprise me if he, gave up entirely on his failed projects and decides to go for Cuba or, somewhere else. So he will lose patience, interest, and someone will come along with another, oh, hey, Mr. President, have you seen what's going on in this other far-flung part of the world? And off he'll go there.
Quiet, Riot.
And now it's time for a little bit of perspective. It's easy living the timeline that we are to lose the big picture, to be consumed with the latest story being breathlessly and excitedly pursued. But a little dive into the archive of what was going on a month ago, a year ago, or a decade ago can reveal interesting, 'twas ever thus patterns, and help place today into a larger frame. So it is my pleasure to introduce another new regular feature inspired by conversations with our subscriber co-editors. It's time to introduce you all to Old News.
The news of yesteryear.
Kenny, you're our news guy. Give us some old news.
Well, For our first old news, I thought we could look at Britain's fave topic, which is, of course, the weather, particularly as we're all looking nervously for signs of a long, hot summer. Hopefully not riots, hopefully suntans, hopefully lots of ice creams with flakes in them. So let me take you back to 1997 and a headline in the Los Angeles Times which reads, El Nino spurs global flood of preparation. El Nino, the paper warned, was shaping up as, and I quote, potentially the most destructive weather pattern in a century. And one scientist, John Christie, gave an even better warning. He said, this year, you are going to hear people blame El Nino for everything. And that is exactly what happened. El Nino became the celebrity villain of global weather. Floods, El Nino. Drought, El Nino. Storms, El Nino. Morrison's meal deal sandwich a bit damp in the middle, probably El Nino. Now, the El Nino phenomenon itself has been around for a long time. Peruvian fishermen noticed centuries ago that every so often the Pacific waters warmed, the fish moved, and the weather changed. They called it El Nino de Navidad, the Christ child, because it arrived around Christmas. These days,
I didn't know that.
No, it's a little bit of poetry in there, isn't
Fabulous,
there? And I mean, these days we all use it to describe the vast cyclical warming of oceanic temperatures across the central and eastern Pacific. Now, fast forward to 2026. We're back with the Los Angeles Times again, and it's writing about El Nino again. One piece from the other day opens, you're going to hear a lot about El Nino this year, and another warns that the next El Nino could be a monster. There's a scientist, of course there is, quoted in the piece, who says it may be potentially a very rare and unusual El Nino event this year. And right there is the echo. Over the coming year, scientists say that this could worsen drought in some places, trigger heavy rainfall in others, and lead to heat waves, putting crops and, indeed, lives at risk. In some ways, then, it's a familiar story, and an alarming one, because the 1997 El Nino event cost an estimated £4.25 trillion.
In then money or now money?
That was in then money.
Bloody Nora.
Yeah, huge. And that's taken over about 5 years because the impacts don't happen
Immediately,
and then
yeah.
it can take 4 to 5 years. So, with that in mind, presumably in the last 3 decades, we've worked out some ways to mitigate some of El Nino's effects. Well, hang on, because although the current El Nino is the same phenomenon in the same ocean, it's not happening in the same world. El Nino itself is natural. Climate change didn't create it. But global heating, well, that changes the world that El Nino arrives in. It can be the difference between dropping a match on damp grass and flicking it at a petrol station. And that's why we shouldn't look at these headlines in isolation. Here are some other stories making headlines from recent weeks. Campaigners say the world's 65 biggest banks committed $906 billion to fossil fuel companies in 2025, including half a trillion to companies expanding oil, gas, and coal.
So
and of
depressing.
Course, Trump has continued to treat the fossil fuel industry not as a planetary risk, but as a valued client with suspiciously good access. So, this week's old news isn't simply that El Nino is back. It's that we had the warnings, we had the science, we had the media coverage, we had almost 30 years. And what have we been doing? We've been making the background hotter, funding the drilling, and acting surprised when the weather gets nastier. And of course, it's all of us that will be paying for the damage, not the fossil fuel companies. Privatise the profits, socialise the costs, and all of that nonsense. So, today's lesson from yesteryear is that there's no such thing as an old story, no such thing as a new story, and, it appears, no such thing as a fix for stupid.
Thanks, Kenny. I like that. We have also done nothing about sandwiches getting soggy, can I say? Which is,
we've been talking about stochastic terrorism as a tort too much, haven't we?
Excuse me, but this is serious stuff. How difficult would it be to create the sandwich corner? Like you have a yogurt with a corner thing that has
like a dried curled up sandwich corner.
Exactly. You could have a corner that has a little compartment for all the
wet things.
Exactly. The tomato, the cucumber, the lettuce. So you can put it together fresh, and it doesn't. Obviously, trademark cooler heads, boilerplate, copyright cooler heads. If you're interested in talking to us, Marks and Spencer,
We've got other ideas where
then
those come from.
we are here. So we'll drop a link in the show notes to that bit of old news so you can go and read up on this blast from the past that is very much extending into the present. And if you have any suggestions about a situation currently in the news not being as unprecedented as journalists love to claim, don't hesitate to send it to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Quiet Riot. And that's the end of today's B-Side show. Make sure you subscribe to Arthur's podcast, Behind the Lines, following him on socials, and do support his Substack, which is really very, very good indeed. We'll leave all the links you need down below in the show notes.
And thanks also to everyone who's tuned in. If you can help support Quiet Riot, head over to ko-fi.com/quietriotpod for $5 a month so we can keep bringing the show free to everyone at the same time, regardless of their ability to pay.
We'll be back on Sunday with our more relaxed chowing on this week's Gristle.
We love you all very much, even more than slightly soggy sandwiches.
Bye.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production from Cooler Heads, written and produced by Andreou, Naomi Smith, and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Ganello, and edited by me, Alex Reese.
Quiet Riot. Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities, so do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.